Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be unpacking Roe v. Wade. We've got excerpts from a podcast that really dives into the personal stories and legal battles behind this landmark case. What do you think of when you hear Roe v. Wade?
It often gets boiled down to abortion rights, but there's so much more to it. The 1960s were a turbulent time with shifting social norms and the rise of feminism, but safe abortion was incredibly limited. Imagine the desperation of women facing unwanted pregnancies with virtually no options. Our source material actually opens with a fictional scenario set in a doctor's office in 1969. It's chillingly effective in conveying the fear and risk women faced back then.
It's easy to forget that behind the legal arguments were real people grappling with incredibly difficult choices. That brings us to Norma McCorvy, the Jane Roe of the case. She was 22, pregnant for the third time, and already struggling to support herself. She'd given up 2 children for adoption and simply couldn't handle another.
McCorvey's situation wasn't unique. Many women lacked the resources to travel to states where abortion was legal or afford a safe illegal procedure. Her case became a symbol of the systemic barriers women faced when it came to reproductive health care. The podcast we're looking at highlights how her lawyers, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, strategically chose McCorvey to represent this broader struggle.
Now, these were 2 young lawyers fresh out of law school taking on a case that was guaranteed to be controversial. Weddington even had her own personal experience with abortion, having traveled to Mexico for the procedure while in law school. What drove them to take on such a challenge?
It's fascinating, isn't it? They saw a blatant injustice and were determined to fight for change. They understood that McCorvey's case wasn't just about one woman. It was about challenging a system that denied women control over their bodies and lives. They deliberately added a second plaintiff, a married couple, to broaden the case's scope even further.
Okay, so they filed a lawsuit. It goes to trial in Dallas in 1970. What was the courtroom atmosphere like?
Our podcast source describes it as surprisingly tense and dramatic. With moments of unexpected laughter mixed with serious legal arguments, imagine these 2 relatively inexperienced lawyers facing off against seasoned attorneys defending the Texas law. Weddington herself apparently almost fainted from nerves at one point.
Wow, talked about pressure. So what were the main arguments presented on each side?
Weddington and Coffey cleverly focused on the right to privacy. They argued that the Texas law infringed on a woman's fundamental right to make decisions about her own body. A right that, though not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, had been recognized in previous Supreme Court rulings. It was a bold strategy, especially in the social climate of the time.
And how did the state of Texas respond? What was their main line of defense?
The Texas Attorney General at the time argued that the state had a compelling interest in protecting potential life from the moment of conception. It was a classic clash between individual rights and the perceived role of the state.
So who won that first round?
It was a partial victory for McCorvey and her legal team. The court ruled that the Texas abortion law was unconstitutional, but it didn't actually stop the state from enforcing it. So while it was a significant legal win, it didn't immediately translate into real change for women seeking abortions in Texas.
So the fight wasn't over. They had to keep pushing forward. What happened next?
Weddington and Coffey, undeterred, decided to appeal the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is where things get even more intriguing, because while all this is happening, the composition of the Supreme Court is shifting. Nixon, a staunch conservative, is appointing new justices, tilting the court in a more conservative direction.
That must have been a nerve-wracking time for the legal team. The political landscape is changing. The stakes are high. And they're about to argue their case before the highest court in the land.
Absolutely, the pressure was immense. The first round of oral arguments took place in December of 1971, but the court wasn't satisfied. They requested a second round of arguments for the following year, a decision that would unexpectedly shape the course of the case.
Oh, how so?
Well, Justice Harry Blackmun, who was tasked with writing the opinion, used that extra time to delve deep into the history of abortion. He spent weeks at the Mayo Clinic Library researching everything he could find on the topic.
That sounds like quite the research rabbit hole. Did he uncover anything particularly surprising?
Blackmun found that abortion had been widely practiced and accepted for centuries, even by ancient Greek physicians. The criminalization of abortion was actually a relatively recent development, largely influenced by changing social and religious views in the 19th century. This historical context completely challenged the idea that abortion had always been considered morally wrong and became a key element in his legal reasoning.
That's fascinating. So his research actually provided a historical basis for viewing abortion differently than the prevailing narrative at the time. How did this impact the second round of oral arguments?
Well, when the second round took place in October of 1972, Weddington delivered a much more confident and compelling argument. She really drove home the point that the right to privacy implied in the 14th Amendment should protect a woman's right to choose. It's interesting to consider how Blackmun's deep dive into history might have indirectly bolstered their case.
It seems like those oral arguments were quite a pivotal moment. How did the Texas lawyer respond to her argument?
He was in at a tough spot, actually. He argued that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception and therefore deserving of state protection. But the justices pressed him, demanding legal and medical evidence to support this claim.
And what happened? Was he able to provide that evidence?
He couldn't. He even admitted there were unanswerable questions about when life truly begins. That admission really undermined the state's position. Imagine being the lawyer in that situation,
Yeah.
facing down the Supreme Court justices.
I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. So what happened after those intense oral arguments?
After the second round, the justices took a preliminary vote, and it was 6-3 in favor of striking down the Texas law. But even with a majority, the path to a final decision was far from smooth. Blackmun's initial draft opinion was actually criticized by some of his colleagues for lacking a strong enough constitutional basis for the right to privacy. This is where his extensive research really came into play.
You mentioned earlier that Blackmun's research was influential. Can you expand on that a bit? How did it affect the final ruling?
His deep understanding of the historical context surrounding abortion allowed him to craft a more nuanced and well-supported opinion. He revised the draft, grounding it firmly in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty. He connected the right to privacy to prior rulings on contraception and interracial marriage, creating a stronger legal foundation for the decision.
So he wasn't just looking at abortion in isolation. He was placing it within the broader context of individual rights and previous legal precedents. That's really interesting.
Exactly. He also came up with this groundbreaking framework that divided pregnancy into 3 trimesters, a concept that wasn't part of the original legal arguments.
The trimester framework, can you explain that a bit further?
It was a clever way to balance the woman's right to choose with the state's interest in protecting potential life. It allowed for greater state regulation of abortion as the pregnancy progressed, acknowledging the increasing viability of the fetus. It was an attempt to provide a legal structure for navigating this complex issue.
So even though Blackmun had a majority, he still had to work within the court, address critiques, and find a way to craft an opinion that was both legally sound and address the concerns of his fellow justices. It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It absolutely was. And there's another layer to the story that highlights the political realities surrounding the case. Even though Chief Justice Burger personally supported legalizing abortion, he didn't want the ruling to be announced right before Nixon's second inauguration.
Wait, really? Why not?
He knew the ruling would be controversial and didn't want to hand Nixon's opponents any ammunition right before such a significant event. It's a reminder of how deeply intertwined law and politics can be, even at the highest levels.
I guess even the Supreme Court can't completely escape those political pressures. So when did the ruling finally come down?
After all the revisions, the debates, and the political maneuvering, the Supreme Court finally announced its decision in Roe v. Wade on January 22, 1973. The Texas law was struck down, effectively legalizing abortion nationwide. It was a 7-2 ruling, and get this, 3 out of the 4 Nixon appointees actually voted in favor of legalization.
Wow. I have to admit, that surprises me.
It's a detail that often gets overlooked and really challenges our assumptions about how political ideology aligns with views on abortion. Here we have Nixon, a staunch conservative, who appointed justices that ultimately contributed to this landmark decision.
That's a great point. It just goes to show that this issue can't be easily categorized or predicted. So how did the public react to such a monumental ruling?
As you might imagine, the reactions were as divided as the nation itself. Pro-choice groups celebrated it as a historic victory for women's rights, a crucial step towards equality and bodily autonomy. On the other hand, anti-abortion groups condemned it as a moral tragedy, the legalization of what they saw as the taking of innocent human life.
I can only imagine how charged the atmosphere must have been. It seems like this ruling, regardless of which side you were on, became a defining moment in the fight for reproductive rights.
Absolutely. Roe v. Wade became a lightning rod, igniting passionate debate and activism on both sides of the issue. It galvanized the anti-abortion movement, leading to decades of efforts to overturn or weaken the ruling. But there's another twist in this story, and it revolves around Norma McCorvy herself.
Oh, what happened to her? You mentioned earlier that she was strategically chosen to represent a larger issue. What became of her after the ruling?
Well, years later, in a surprising turn of events, McCorvy publicly renounced her stance on abortion and became a vocal advocate for the anti-abortion movement. She even joined Operation Rescue, a radical anti-abortion group known for its aggressive tactics.
That's a pretty dramatic shift. What led to that change?
It's a complex story that speaks to the deeply personal and often evolving nature of beliefs about abortion. McCorvy's life after Roe was marked by personal struggles, religious conversion, and a growing sense of disillusionment. It's also a reminder that legal victories don't always translate into neat and tidy resolutions in people's lives.
It sounds like her story, even after the ruling, continued to be shaped by the complexities of this issue. I imagine her later activism must have been difficult for the lawyers who had fought so hard for her right to choose.
It certainly added another layer of complexity to the narrative surrounding Roe v. Wade. But there's even more to McCorvy's story, something that emerged shortly before her death in 2017.
What do you mean?
In a documentary released posthumously, McCorvy claimed that she was actually paid by anti-abortion groups to speak out against abortion. She stated that she didn't truly believe what she was saying and felt exploited by the movement.
Wow, that's a bombshell revelation.
Her later statements raise important questions about the influence of money and ideology on shaping public discourse around abortion. It adds a layer of tragedy to her story, suggesting that she may have been used as a pawn in a larger political game.
It's heartbreaking to think that someone who was so central to this landmark case could end up feeling manipulated and betrayed. It just reinforces the fact that there are real people at the heart of this issue, people with their own complex stories and struggles.
You're absolutely right. So while Roe v. Wade was undoubtedly a watershed moment, it didn't mark the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning of a long and ongoing battle over reproductive rights.
And what about the impact of the ruling itself? We've talked a lot about the legal and political fallout, but what were the tangible effects on women's lives?
The most immediate impact was on women's health. Legalizing abortion led to a dramatic decrease in deaths from unsafe illegal procedures. It also gave women greater control over their reproductive lives, enabling them to make choices about their education, careers, and family planning without the fear of an unwanted pregnancy. However, as we touched upon earlier, the backlash to Roe v. Wade was swift and fierce.
It seems like this ruling really became a focal point for the ongoing debate about abortion. How did that backlash manifest itself? Were there specific actions taken to undermine or challenge the ruling?
Absolutely. Anti-abortion groups and lawmakers immediately began strategizing ways to restrict abortion access. They pursued various legal challenges, attempting to chip away at Roe through court cases and legislation. Their efforts led to the passage of numerous state-level restrictions, such as parental notification laws, mandatory waiting periods, and limitations on funding for abortion services.
These restrictions, while often framed as measures to protect women's health or fetal life, seem to have created significant obstacles for women seeking abortions.
Precisely. Those most affected were often low-income women, those living in rural areas with limited access to health care, and young people who might face difficulties involving their parents in their decision. These restrictions didn't eliminate abortion, but they made it more difficult and, in some cases, dangerous to obtain.
You mentioned limitations on funding for abortion services. Didn't that lead to a very tragic situation with a woman named Rosie Jimenez?
Yes, Rosie Jimenez's story is a heartbreaking illustration of the real-world consequences of restricting abortion access. She was a young, single mother living in Texas who died in 1977 after a botched illegal abortion. She couldn't afford a safe legal procedure because Medicaid wouldn't cover it due to the Hyde Amendment, a policy that prohibits federal funding for most abortions.
It's a stark reminder that these legal and political battles have very real human costs.
Absolutely. Rosie Jimenez's story isn't an isolated incident. It represents a broader pattern of how restricting abortion access, particularly for those who are already marginalized, can lead to unsafe practices and tragic outcomes. The Hyde Amendment specifically has had a disproportionate impact on low-income women and women of color, further exacerbating existing health disparities.
So even though Roe v. Wade legalized abortion nationwide, the fight for reproductive rights continued and continues to this day. What does the future hold for Roe? Is its legacy secure?
Well, the legal and political landscape surrounding abortion is constantly evolving. While Roe remains the law of the land, it has been weakened over time by various Supreme Court rulings and state-level restrictions. The future of Roe is uncertain with ongoing legal challenges and a shifting political climate. It's a reminder that legal victories, while important, don't always translate into permanent change. They require ongoing vigilance and advocacy to protect and uphold them.
It sounds like Roe v. Wade, while a pivotal moment in the fight for reproductive rights, was just one chapter in a much larger story.
Precisely. And that story is still being written. Understanding the historical context, the legal complexities, the personal stories, and the ongoing challenges is crucial for anyone who wants to engage in this debate in a meaningful way.
It seems like Roe v. Wade, as a symbol, has come to represent so much more than just the legal right to abortion. It's become a focal point for discussions about bodily autonomy, women's rights, and the role of government in personal decision making.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that's what makes this issue so compelling and enduring. It raises fundamental questions about individual liberty, the definition of life, and the balance of power between the individual and the state. These are questions that every generation grapples with, and the answers are rarely simple or straightforward.
So, knowing all of this, the history, the legal battles, the human stories, where do we go from here? How do we navigate such a complex and emotionally charged issue?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, and any solution will require empathy, critical thinking, and a willingness to engage with diverse perspectives. It's crucial to move beyond the polarized rhetoric and strive for a more nuanced understanding of the issue.
It sounds like you're advocating for a more thoughtful and compassionate approach to this debate, one that recognizes the complexities and respects the deeply held beliefs on both sides.
Exactly. We need to create spaces for open dialogue where we can listen to each other's stories, understand different viewpoints, and find common ground where possible. It's not about winning or losing, but about finding ways to move forward as a society while respecting individual rights and ensuring the well-being of all involved.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've delved into the legal intricacies, the political maneuvering, and the very human stories that have shaped the legacy of Roe v. Wade. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that Roe v. Wade, while a monumental legal decision, was just one step in a much larger journey toward achieving reproductive justice. It's a journey that requires continued vigilance advocacy and a commitment to ensuring that all individuals have the freedom and resources to make informed decisions about their reproductive lives.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has only scratched the surface of this complex and multifaceted issue. I encourage you to continue exploring, researching, and engaging with this topic from all angles. Listen to diverse voices, examine the evidence, and form your own informed opinions. This is a conversation that deserves our continued attention, our empathy, and our thoughtful consideration.